Hello again, English 111 students. Going to talk to you a little bit about documentation and citation. Sorry for the weird glare in my glasses, but unfortunately it can't be avoided the way I've got my lighting set up, which is very unprofessionally done. But a few things to cover that have to do with the textbook and documentation and research. Out of necessity, because of time and because of limited instructional time, I'm going to limit considerably the amount of information that I convey to you about documentation, and we're going to keep it to the pretty much the bones, and just trust that on a following semester when you're in English 112, we'll pick up some of what was not covered during 111 that would be really difficult to do without having a person-to-person and a lot of in-class time where we can work and show and demonstrate. I will give you everything you need to know in order to be able to document sources and do your citations properly. But I just want you to know ahead of time that it's going to be just the essential information that you need to know. If you don't have your little Siegel handbook, you need to get that now, so pause the vid and then go get your book and come back. We are going to walk through the green section of the textbook, and I'm going to explain a few things as we go through what you need to know, and I try to get most of this into one video. I might have to do two videos. There's an exercise associated with this as well. I do not want you to do the exercise until after you have seen the complete video. You might want to watch parts of the video more than once just to get an idea, because you will not be prepared to do the exercise because you won't know what the expectation is for it until you watch the video. So make sure that you go through this from one end to the other. Let's start by looking at the opening section, the green section of the book. That's technically, it starts on page 119 of the Little Siegel Handbook, but I want to start on page 120. This is where it shows you how to cite sources for a works cited page. The works cited page is simply that page which conveys all of the documentation information that you're going to use in your paper. It's not a bibliography, if you've done one of those before. A works cited page means these are the works that I have cited in my paper. So the only thing on a works cited page will be information about sources that you actually quoted or paraphrased from in your paper. So keep your finger there on page 120. Turn to the last two pages of the green section, which is 168 and 169, and you'll see an example of what a works cited page should look like. So let's take a look at that for a second. You'll notice that the format doesn't change. It's still 1-inch margins, double space, Courier, New 12, all of that stays the same. The difference here, of course, is that at the top, centered, you have the words works cited, and then your entries begin. No extra spaces, no skip spaces, but it's a reverse indent, which means the opposite of a paragraph. Paragraph, you indent the first line, all the other lines go to the left margin. For documentation on a works cited page, you don't indent the first line, and all the other lines are indented, so keep that in mind. Quick note, if you're trying to set this up and do it manually, when you get to the end of your first line, you will have to hit return. When the cursor goes back to the beginning of the next line, then you can tab in and set up those tabs. If you just go to the second line and try to tab it, it will move everything over, and you'll just get frustrated, so keep that in mind. A couple of things to note about the works cited page. Notice it is listed by author's last name and then first name, and it's also listed alphabetically. So keep those couple of things in mind. We're going to refer to 168 and 169 periodically, so keep that in mind. But there's two full pages. On those two pages, they show you exactly what a works cited page should look like. As you're setting yours up, make sure that you compare yours to this and that yours looks just like it. If yours doesn't look like this, then yours is the one that's incorrect, obviously. All right, back to page 120, 121, and 122. These three pages show us, give us all the information, kind of a table of contents, about how to find the correct page in the book if I want to cite a particular kind of source. Examples. I have a book. How do I cite a book? I have a book with two authors. How do I cite that? I have a magazine article that I found online. How would I cite that source? I found a blog, and I'm going to quote from a blog. I did an interview. Where do I go in the textbook to know how to cite that information? Generically, the information falls into kind of 4 categories in order. You always start with the author's name, then you move to the title information of the articles and or magazines or journals. Then you move to publication information if there is any needed. And then you move to the date that you found that information and a URL. So that's the order that it will always appear in. It might include other things, but they will always fall into those 4 categories, author's names first. If you don't have one of those things, you don't have an author's name, for example, it's an anonymous article, then you would start with the next, which would be the title information. And I'll show you examples of those things in the book. But to look at the table of contents, starting on page 120, you see it's divided into several categories. It's divided a little oddly at first. I'm not sure why they did it in this edition of the handbook, but it is what it is. The first 7 entries there on page 120 show you how to cite something that has an author. Usually you're referring to a book of some kind. But this is where you would go if you say, well, I've got 5 authors for this article. How do I cite that kind of source? Then you look at number 4. It says, you would look at number 3, where it says 3 or more authors. You turn to that page number and it'll show you how to cite that particular thing. One place I want to make a couple of comments, some things that you will need to keep in mind. One place you do definitely want to note is number 7, government as author. Many of you will use government documents in some of your research throughout your college experience, and it isn't listed alphabetically by the word government, so you might have to hunt for it. If you circle that or put a note in your margin that that's where you would find government documentation information, that's a good thing to remember. The second section, where it says articles and other short works, this is where you would go if you have an article in a journal, newspaper, magazine, something like that. So number 8, article in a journal, that's a scholarly journal. Number 9, a magazine. Number 10, a newspaper. Number 11, you might want to note this one, article access through a database. What that means is you went to a database usually associated with a library in order to get into this particular bit of information. The most common would be NC Live. If you were using NC Live, then you would want to definitely use number 11 to show you how to include database information for NC Live. The next section, number 17 and following, are books, physical books or books that you found online. Primarily these are physical books, an anthology. Number 23, a sacred text. So if you're quoting something from the Bible or for the Quran or something like that, then you would use that particular source. The next section is very short. It's only 4 entries, but it's probably the one that you will use the most, and that has to do with anything you found online. Notice the first one, it says number 30, an entire website. That's unusual. You don't usually cite a whole website unless the entire website is dedicated to only one thing, but most of you, probably all of you, for 90% of the time will be looking at number 31, a work on a website. So this is where you found something on a website and you want to cite it. You would turn to page 151 and it'll show you how to do that. The next one is a blog entry. You'll see number 32. Many of you will cite blogs. That's perfectly fine. As long as the writer of the blog is a professional or scholar in the field, the blog is acceptable. And the number 33, just avoid. Anything associated with wiki is going to be general information typically anyway, so don't use that. The next section, 34 through 38, this is personal communication. So if you're using personal communication device of some kind via the internet or through a computer program or a phone, it's going to fall into this category, emails, texts, and that sort of thing. The last section, number 39 and following, is kind of the kitchen drawer, junk drawer kind of section. Anything else that doesn't fall neatly into those other categories, you see relatively quickly that that's what it is. You see art or cartoons or advertisement if you turn the page, films. Number 44, interviews of any kind. An interview that you do, an interview that you watch on television, YouTube, TED Talk, something like that, or an interview that you read in a magazine where one person is interviewing another person. That would all go there. And then number 48 is also an important one. If you attend a lecture or a presentation where someone is actually speaking and you have an opportunity to hear that and take notes from it, that's where you would turn to do that particular citation. So those are kind of the general categories, books, magazines and newspapers, things you find online, and then kind of all of the other stuff that doesn't really fit neatly into a category. Let's look at a couple of examples, and I'll show you how to use the book and how it works. Let's say, for an example, that you found a magazine online and you want to be able to cite the article from the magazine that you found online, where do you begin? Well, you scroll down in the table of contents on page 120. You see in the second section, number 9, article in a magazine. So it says to turn to page 139. So do that. Turn to page 139. When you get to page 139, you'll see article in a magazine. This is where you have to be very, very careful. Pay close attention. There are 2 ways that you would cite something from a magazine. Both are given to you right here. But notice, number 9, article in a magazine, it then says print. If you are looking, have in your hands the actual print copy, then that's what you would use. But if you are looking at a screen, any form of a screen, you are looking at it through a computer program of some kind, then you would go to the next segment which says online. And that's where you would cite the source. And notice 2 things. 1, they give you a complete explanation, color-coded, so you know what section is what. You have the author's last name, first name, title of the article, name of the magazine, date on the web, pages, URL, access date. All that stuff is given to you. This is the order. This is what it looks like. It also tells you where the punctuation goes, what kind of punctuation to use in between, and what is italicized or in quotation marks. And the next thing, which I find personally to be even more helpful than the explanation, is an example. Every single item in here, they provide at least 1 example for each one. So you'll see Kazan Olga, forgetting and remembering your first language, the example underneath for the online. It shows you what the title will look like. If you say, wow, should I capitalize all the terms? Do I capitalize only certain terms? Look at the example. What does it do? When I italicize something and I put a punctuation mark, what goes after the name of the magazine? Look at the example. What do they do? When I find the date, and the date is in an unusual order, it's all numbers, how do I put the date in? What does it look like? Don't question it. Just look at the example. This is what you do. Use the example to show you how to set up the source, and you will get it right every single time. Over and over and over again, students make mistakes with their citation and documentation because they didn't look at the examples that are given to them in the book. They just guessed. Don't guess. Now, let me back up a step here where something we talked about earlier. Let's say you find a magazine article online, but you found it through a database. You found it through NC Live. That's going to be very common. So what do you do? Because it doesn't say anything about a database in here. There's no way the MLA handbook could give you every possible combination of every possible connection between sources. So they list them in areas, and you're going to have to do some of the combining. If it's an article from a magazine, this is where you would go, page 139, to cite the source. If it's from a database, all you need to know is where do I put the information about the database if it's an article from a magazine. So you've already done the article from a magazine online information. Then you'd go back to your table of contents on page 120, 121, and you'll see on page 120, number 11, article access through a database. That will show you where the name of the database would go in a citation. So look at page 141, very next page of what we've been looking at. Number 11, article through a database, and you'll see that the name of the database comes after any pages that are listed and before the URL. So, you've got your citation done for the magazine that you found online. You go to the place where the pages would be and the URL, and you put the database name in between those 2 things. And everything is good. That's all you need to worry about. Let's say, for example, another thing, you have an article from a magazine, and you are citing that source, but you have 2 authors. So what do I do with 2 authors? Again, go back to page 120, page 120, and you'll see at the top, number 2, it says 2 authors. So I turn to page 134. On page 134, it shows me how to list 2 authors' names. And so when I'm doing my magazine article or an online article or something I found in a newspaper or whatever, don't look all through that section to try to find how to do 2 authors. Go back to the table of contents. How do I do 2 authors? Turn to that page and you'll see it shows you authors' names, last name first, and then the first and last name of the second author, where the punctuation goes. If I use the word and, all of it is in there. Here's the key. Citing sources with your MLA handbook at first seems overwhelming. It's a lot of information. You can kind of get lost in all of it. Relax. step back from it, say I'm going to use my table of contents, I'm going to look up each part.